Mine still says, oh, there we go. Hey, hello, everybody. Welcome to the first Connected Courses live session. I'm here with Randy Bass and Kathy Davidson, and we're going to talk about the end of higher education, both in that sort of gloomy sense of what's happening right now and are things, are we really coming to an end? Are we at a turning point? But also about the end of higher education, as in the purpose of higher education. What should it be? And if this is a moment of reinvention, maybe this is a chance to redefine who we are and what we're doing. So we have Randy Bass and Kathy Davidson, two outstanding scholars and great thinkers in this area. Randy is a vice provost for education and the professor of English at Georgetown University. He was also the founding director of Georgetown's Center for New Designs in Learning and Scholarship, or CANDLES. Really wonderful organization, and I had the pleasure of visiting there once and had a wonderful time. Just a great space of innovation in education and pedagogy. He's written many wonderful things. I'll just point to one that might be relevant to this. I think it was just maybe a couple years ago, the Disrupting Ourselves, the Problem of Learning in Higher Education. That's a great article that I think provides some good background for some of the things we'll be talking about today. And then also we have Kathy Davidson here. Kathy recently moved to the Graduate Center at the City University of New York. She's now the Distinguished Professor and Director of the Futures Initiative there, which is a program designed to train the next generation of college professors. And I saw once how many people you might be affecting, but it's tremendous, and I think we're all excited to have somebody like you in that position affecting so many people and possibly, having a tremendous influence on the future of higher education through that role. Kathy has authored a number of great books. Recently she wrote Now You See It, which also offers some great reflection on her own life and how she's learned over the years, and there's some great stories in there. I don't want to spoil it for you guys, but you should all read it right from the beginning so you can get a sense of how somebody can take their own life experience and learn from it and create better learners for it. So I'll leave it at that, and we'll go ahead and get started. The way we're going to start out is actually I've asked them all each to reflect on the best class they ever taught. So we're going to start there, and Randy, do you want to start us off with the best class that you ever taught?
Well, sure, and this is, of course, in my own mind, and not necessarily in the opinion of the students, but thank you, Michael, for inviting me, and it's great to be here. I would say one of the most rewarding classes I ever taught was a course that I co-taught with an architect, Ann Pendleton-Julian. It was called The Future of the University as a Design Problem, so pertinent to our topic. But we taught it as what we call the humanities studio, and it was a blend of the kind of inquiry that you would do in a seminar, but rigorously taught like an architecture studio. So we had what architects would call table crits or desk crits and wall crits, where students would pin up their work, and formal presentations of their work where we flew people in for the midterm and had guests at the final. And after doing precedent work and reading theory and background, students spent most of the time working on their designs of what the university would look like in 2030. It really could have been any topic. The point was that in groups they were working on a design-based concept that they made their own, and it was their own from beginning to end. The rhythm of this, they were mostly working in drawings. They would work for hours and then come in for critiques and then go away with the 10% of their idea that was still live and throw away 90%. I taught writing for 25 years as an English professor. I've never taught a class where the students became so fearless of revision in a way that just had them just driven for the idea. It was an atmosphere of great student ownership. They felt like they were working on a problem that mattered to them. They were presenting to an authentic audience. The two of us as faculty were really just bumpers or scaffolds for them. And all my career, I've really wanted to make the classroom a place where people thought of it as a place to come to work, not a place to come to listen, and that's really what the studio is. It's a place where you come to work on your own with your small group and with your mentors. So that was I think the most rewarding class I taught, and those were some of the salient features.
Mm-hmm. That's great. How about you, Kathy?
I'm going to mention one class that then became the basis of a second class, and these are the last 2 years that I taught at Duke University. One was a class on 21st century literacies, and we were doing, it was students from Duke, University of North Carolina, and NC State University. I had to go away and give a talk at the Digital Media and Learning Conference. We were going to be, so my students helped prepare, and they were going to be virtual participants at that conference. We'd been using lots of collaborative tools throughout the course. It didn't seem like a problem to be gone. The virtual panel worked great. I came back and the students had mutinied. And I use learning contracts in my classes. We created class constitution. They'd thrown everything out. And so they didn't want to do that, which is kind of the fear that many academics have about peer-led, student-led work. Except, instead of them trying to get away with something, what they decided was they loved what we were doing so much they wanted to write a handbook about it for the rest of the world. And they rewrote their contract saying if on final exam time they did not deliver a completed book manuscript, with each of them doing a chapter, and they'd already done the table of content and everything, they would all fail the course. Now, as an academic, I would never fail everybody for not working collectively, but they were willing to put their reputations on the line. I don't know what I would have done if they hadn't done it, but here's the book. We did a physical book. It's also up on GitHub. It's on Haystack. It's been downloaded 16,000 times just from the Haystack website. I don't know what the numbers are from other sources. The following year, I then taught a MOOC on the history and future of higher education where we used this as our textbook for 18,000 students. I had 18 face-to-face students, again, from Duke, North Carolina State, and University of North Carolina, undergraduate, graduate students from computer science to MFA students. And the students were used the MOOC as a chance to think about MOOCs. It was kind of what we called it the meta MOOC. And the Chronicle of Higher Education asked me actually to write a column each week on it, and I said, well, that would be hypocritical if I wrote the column. So each week my students wrote the column, and we, again, self-published it as a little book of their columns each week on what they were learning from co-teaching the MOOC. And our final project, partly inspired by what Randy and Ann had done, I was working closely with Ann during the year, was a project of creating higher ed from scratch. And we had 3 different design teams where we asked probably 200 questions about what is an education for, and then did business plans, models, CAD drawings of 3 very, very different kinds of institutions. Fascinating. Also, as Randy said, it was a situation where I came in and listened far more than I taught. It was an amazing experience. The downside was with the MOOC, students were awake 24/7, literally, the endless cycle, and my students were so engaged. They were saying they weren't sleeping at all. They were up all night typing to people, and there was a group in Otago, New Zealand. There was another group in India. There was another group in Thailand. There were several groups in Europe and in Latin America, and they were up all night talking about assessment, new plans for assessment, and new ideas for assessment, and other kinds of topics of relevant to the history and future of higher education. So the upside, engagement, the downside, insomnia. So, yeah. But it was an incredible experience.
Yeah, I mean, I can relate to that. I mean, I guess the favorite class that I pull out is a very small class. It's 10 students, and every year we've been kind of pushing the envelope of how authentic it gets, I guess. So it's a methods class, and in this case, anthropology methods. And so I'm just trying to get them to do anthropology. And so my favorite class in this last year, they actually got to move into a retirement community and live there for the whole semester. So it's very, you know, in many ways we were disconnected from the wider world in terms of we weren't leveraging the internet like we normally do. But it was really special, and I think we still like hit a lot of these things that you guys have been talking about. I mean, the sense of ownership, the fearlessness of revision, and all of that I think came because we were studying problems that matter. We had this authentic audience that we were working for. All these things that you guys mentioned just now, and I mean, we can go on and on. These are, you guys hit on some really great stuff. Kathy, you mentioned the contract, and not only the contract, but also the rewriting of the contract, and that was obviously emblematic of this intense engagement, which obviously almost went too far, right? So we have all these different elements, and I think these classes that we've each described, in many ways, describe something special happening when people come together to learn together, right? It's something that can't happen just in learning on your own. So that then gets at the next question I wanted to approach, and that is, what is this education all about? What can higher education be for? And when you hear a lot of the rhetoric now about how education is changing and these apocalyptic visions of the end of higher education, do you guys hear any kind of assumptions about what the purpose of higher education is in those different visions? And are there visions that concern you? Are there people who seem to be suggesting that education is kind of for something that's maybe not as complete as the experiences we just described?
Sure. Should I go ahead, Randy, or do you want to go ahead?
No, go ahead.
Well, I have a number of thoughts. One, I actually think that the gloom and doom about higher education being over is premature, and as to paraphrase Twain, as we all do, one thing about MOOCs, massive online open courseware, is clearly if we are willing to offer the products of higher education and specialized learning for free and in a way people can access it, millions of people want it. So for a while, I would say 5 years ago, the rhetoric was higher education's over, nobody's interested, it's a bunch of fuddy-duddies doing their own navel-gazing, there's no engagement with the world. Well, guess what? You put it online for free, and millions of people around the world want it. And the demographics of MOOCs are the same people who are part of the board at work movement. You know, 30 years old, you already have a degree, you're not doing this for any other reason but that you really want some kind of intellectual, emotional nourishment in the world. So I think higher education is more validated now than ever. The cost is a real problem, and the cost is because of 50 years of defunding of public education and of research. And the part that to me is the end of higher education in the negative sense is people who see higher education as being a gold mine and a profit mine that's for things that have nothing whatsoever to do with education, but only have to do with what I literally mean in the historic sense of profiteering, which is a quasi-legal set of structures that make it possible for somebody to get too much money for too little effort, with too little competition among other sources, and for reasons that are different than the mission of the education. So that to me is the big thing to worry about right now. Higher education itself, I think, has never been more vital and never been more needed. At the same time, I do believe, and I say this a lot, that if we can be replaced by a computer screen, we should be. And by that I mean if we're not doing something amazing in our classroom and taking this very precious thing we have of the opportunity to interact with one another, whether it's on screen like this or face-to-face, if we're not figuring out a better way of doing it than sitting up there like a robot, yabbering at people who are reading the newspaper in those classrooms that abolished laptops, as if that's going to solve the problem, then we should be replaced by computer screens. And I think it's a challenge to us to be as meaningful and urgent and relevant and connected to people's lives and connected to one another as we possibly can, and to make the educational system experience something that truly is life-changing. And if it isn't life-changing, then sure, go to a degree mill, do whatever you have to do to get your education. But you know, that's my polemic.
Yeah. Well, I completely agree, and I think that what it is that we believe that is different about higher education from other modes of learning is not necessarily what has always been the reality. So I think that we believe in the values that it can be life-changing, it can be transformational, it can be holistic. Of course, the reality is that for lots of students who pass through very traditional-looking universities, they're not actually getting that kind of education. So think part of what I hope that the kind of apocalyptic wave, those 2 or 3 years when we all went extinct according to the front pages of the media and we all came back to life, when MOOCs went extinct and now we're back and everything's okay, is that it's putting pressure on us to ask the questions about how effective are we really doing the things that we claim we're doing. I think that we haven't done a particularly good job at the evidence of what difference it makes to go through this kind of an education versus getting your learning somewhere else. Nor have we always done a very good job across higher education for a really diverse, broad, equitable population of thinking about the design of the overall education and to what extent the entire education is really tending toward this transformation. I think a lot of people have enjoyed the luxury that somehow the whole package, the milieu of the campus, finding that exceptional relationship with a professor, the opportunity in a co-curricular experience, that ends up being transformational. With a lot of time spent in courses that are not inspirational or transformational, a lot of other activity that feels like you're just moving through requirements or checking boxes. So we're far from having, you know, designed a system that's really optimized for the kind of learning that I think we all believe that the institution can provide.
Mm-hmm. And I think the people who are, you know, here with us today are coming at this in 2 ways, right? One is they're thinking about how to change the structure a little bit, and they're thinking about leveraging the internet and creating informal networks of learning and so on that could merge with formal networks of learning. So there's they're working on that element, and then I think most people listening in right now are also teachers in the traditional sense. A lot of them actually have classrooms. So if reaching out to those people who are listening right now, and we think about this problem of a lack of purpose in the classroom and these and so on, where they're not having these life-changing transformational experiences. Do you have any advice for how they can rethink their classes at a very basic level, like sort of rediscover the purpose of the classes they're teaching? Do you have any ideas about how they can find that purpose?
Well, I remember hearing someone ask, this was Peter Felton, who teaches at Elon University, but he asked the question of a faculty workshop once to say, asking faculty, how will you help your students understand why you're passionate about your subject? So that's even a prior question to how do you make them passionate or make them care or help them get through. And I always thought that was a lovely way to turn that around. And in thinking about that over the years, it's occurred to me that one of the things that I think that we often overlook is that what it is that most expert learners are passionate about, those of us who teach, is difficulty, is what it is that makes a particular domain difficult, whether it's textual studies or mathematics or science, that it's really a love of difficulty in a domain that actually makes experts expert, is that they love uncertainty. They love going after things where they can exercise everything that they know after something that's quite open-ended. And so I think that that's one of the most important ways to convey your passion is to give students a real sense of immersion and experience of difficulty, but in a way in which they can find that a really generative experience, not that they'll just be lost.
Yeah, I would agree with that. And there's a statistic that always makes me sad, and I've just heard another one that makes me even sadder. And the sad one is that middle-class parents spend who have children who are of high school age spend 7 times more on finding after-school enhancements for their kids' intellectual life than working-class parents. That's a bigger consumer differential than housing, vacations, cars, luxury items, and it's parents desperately looking for that thing that's going to motivate a kid that isn't happening in school. And you know, it's the middle class way of life, driving your kids a million places, trying to find that thing that will spark them to do that challenging, difficult thing that you were talking about, Randy. The other one I read just recently, it was in a column by Steven Pinker, which I didn't agree with just about anything else in the column, but I really liked knowing this. He talked about an economist who did a feature that showed that elite private institutions spend 20 times more than non-elite public institutions, less affluent institutions, on things to spark students' interest and retention in college. So those are two numbers, however one disputes them or thinks about in other ways, that are really important to take to heart. So in other words, we're so sure that what makes our kids succeed in the world is they find that thing they're willing to fight for no matter what it is, and they're more passionate about than anything. And that will be the thing that organizes the way they learn and ideally give them a pathway to a successful life. Because we know if you work hard at something, you're much more likely to succeed than if you just grind out something you think is vocational, which is a stupid word. I mean, I think the idea of, I love Amatri Sen's idea that what our job is absolutely vocational education, and the vocation is to lead a productive adult life. It's not STEM, or you can't do STEM if you're not good at STEM, and if you're not interested in STEM, that's not a vocation. That's a vocation in a glass ceiling and in a dead end. So finding that thing that sparks you. But even at our most, and Pinker was talking about Harvard, but even at our most prestigious universities, that we have to spend that much time and interest to keep students motivated to graduate. And of course, the graduation rate at a school like Harvard is about 95%. But if they're spending 20 times more on that than at a state university where the graduation rate might be 50%, there's some gap there that we as teachers aren't just doing in the classroom. That's about social clubs. I've also heard another one about that if you ask students surveys 10 years out of what they learned in college, it's about 50-50 for what they learned in classrooms versus what they learned in their social clubs. They even factored out fraternities and sororities and are looking for non-fraternity and sorority social clubs. Well, that's really interesting because not all college education can be residential. But what is it that we're not doing in the classroom that has to be supplied in other ways? And blending more of that seems some of the urgency of higher education and a more equitable higher education. It's why I left a phenomenal university. I had a wonderful career for 25 years at Duke University to come to a state, the largest public urban state universities. I really feel a commitment to give that kind of quality education at a state university system and a public, in this case, city university system.
Yeah, I share that same passion, and that's why I'm here at K-State. We have a 99% acceptance rate, so,
wow.
So we're letting everybody in, and I teach a big intro class, with hundreds of students, and so this question of why hits me in a different way, right? So like I'm teaching anthropology. It seems like this very obscure subject. Why would 450 students be required to take this class? And they're there because they're required. So for them, the why is already answered. Well, because it fulfills this requirement. And I'm trying to convince them of a deeper why, a bigger why. And the more I've dug into that, I feel sometimes sacrilegious in this in a way, because I find myself drifting away from sort of core ideas about what anthropology is, and I'm not so much teaching anthropology as a discipline, because I have to realize, and I've done the surveys, 0.5% of my students at best will be using anthropology as a discipline in their career. However, I do think this can be a life-changing course. And so I think it's been a wonderful meditation over the years to really think about what can we draw out of the lessons of the discipline that can speak to, a sort of a more general public. So that's one thing I would encourage people to do in their own disciplines, actually, is to, and I guess what's happened with me is that I've found that the motivating questions of my discipline are actually questions that everybody cares about. And when I get in touch with those motivating questions, then we're all asking those great questions together. And by motivating questions, I mean these are questions that will never have definitive answers, and yet really all the theoretical trends and everything that moves around anthropology is really dancing off of those questions. So that's one thing I would suggest to people out there, is to kind of think about what those might be. So that actually gets to another idea here, and is this idea of a purpose-driven course as opposed to a content-driven course. And as people are designing their classes out there and thinking about their classes, I sent you guys a note to kind of think about this, like what would a purpose-driven course look like versus a content-driven course, and what are some of the key elements for how we could structure that purpose-driven course. Both of you have done wonderful examples of this, so could you share some ideas?
We're being polite. I don't know if you want to go first, Randy, or if you want me to go first.
Go ahead.
Okay. So I didn't quite answer the question last time about something somebody can do, so I'm going to go back to that idea of what somebody could do tomorrow in a class, because I think it relates to purpose-driven courses. My technology that I use in all my classes is an index card, and if I'm worried about recycling, I use recycled index cards, or I make index cards from the recycling bin. And I use something I learned from a second grade teacher that's also something that's used in medical schools, and it's called Think, Pair, Share. So at every single class I do, and whenever I'm giving a public lecture, whether it's 6,000 people or 5 people, I will stop and set a timer for 90 seconds and have people get out their index cards and write 3 things that are urgently on their minds at that moment that our conversation is sparked. And then I give them 90 seconds to talk to somebody who's next to them, ideally someone they don't know if it's a big lecture, where they look at the 6 things and decide what's the most important thing, what's the most urgent thing they feel, and then together they propose that one thing to the group, and that's the basis of discussion. The reason why that's purpose-driven is I think it's very, very hard, and I think this goes back is to help people learn how to learn. And there's some magic that happens when you write something down quickly on a card and then talk about it with another person. I don't think Plato was wrong about dialogue, but dialogue is often, when we do it in a big lecture room, or when we do it even in a small seminar room, dialogue is a lot about performance, and lots of people are silent. All the data shows that we are so desperate to get somebody to talk in a class that if 20% of a class talks, we think it's 100%. And this little index card is a fantastic way for the shy people. It's a fantastic way for the people who feel compelled to be extroverts in a class, because it really it gives a kind of a sense of a community and an idea. This is the purpose part. So this is a very simple, cheap, almost free method. The purpose part is it makes the purpose of a classroom helping you to think through ideas with the presence of somebody else. And this little simple tool is an incredibly useful tool that anyone can use tomorrow. I don't ever give a talk or a meeting, even my haystack meetings, we use these index cards because there's always something we aren't hearing. And there's something about this little act of putting something down and then having to talk it through and then present it to a group. What it also does, it takes every learner and makes every learner a teacher. And I think every student has a right to be a teacher.
I would build off of that by saying I think one of the most important adaptable features to me that it would be part of what you're calling a purpose-driven course is what we've called over the years an authentic audience. I think that the professor is generally not an authentic audience for students. And we looked at lots and lots of examples across all kinds of disciplines at every level of higher education. And what many of them share is kind of social learning dimension where there is an authentic audience. That often implies that there's authentic work going on and there's something useful and purposeful going on. But even just having an audience that's outside the boundaries of the class or outside that student-faculty relationship suddenly bursts out of a bubble, which might be one of the first principle of an open and connected course is to get outside of the bubble of the kind of schoolish or scholastic relationship that people have become quite accustomed to. To me, one of the most important things in any field that you're trying to get people to cultivate, get students to cultivate, is, to use a term that Lee Schulman used to use, to engage in accountable talk or accountable thought. And we all strive for that in the classroom, but that relationship between feeling accountable for things you say and a sense of an authentic audience, that you're ultimately trying to construct knowledge for somebody else. And that matters, that you develop a sense of responsibility, whatever the domain is. There's some sense of responsibility to get it right. But there's a really powerful reciprocity between accountable talk and a sense of responsibility to others. And there's a million ways we could talk about that in concrete pedagogical terms, but to me, that's one of the things that runs through almost all purpose-driven courses, if not all purpose-driven.
Yeah, that's a great transition to something we should talk about next, and that is we've been talking about sort of traditional classrooms, but now getting into this idea of connected courses. This accountability and building authentic audience. Those are those are things that come naturally through a connected course. But are there other things? So for the last couple of weeks, a lot of the people listening in now have actually been learning sort of the technical aspects of how to set up a connected course. They've learned how to set up a WordPress blog and feed it into, or create feeds that all feed into a single blog. They've learned how to aggregate feeds. A lot of great technical stuff. And now turning to you guys, what are some of the social structures or social contracts that need to be created to make a connected course work?
Yeah. Well, I actually have my classes. I've been teaching public engagement since I began teaching. I won't even say how long ago that was, but it was many decades ago. I've never not taught classes where there hasn't been a public face, so I was really happy when the internet was invented. It made it a lot easier. The organization I co-founded in 2002, Haystack, which now has 14,000 people, and is one of the busiest open learning hubs on the World Wide Web. We did a connected course in 2006, 2007 called the Information Year, and each month a different set of universities took on a theme and did public programming. But it was before Twitter, so we didn't have the kind of tools. We were inventing it as we were going along. But in the last, I would say, 10 years, I've evolved a program where when I teach a class, I have my students do an open public Google Doc where they take somebody else's constitution and turn it into a constitution for the class, and then make it go public and invite anybody else to contribute to it. So it sets up the rules of engagement for the conversation, and I'm always amazed at the different rules of engagement that students come up with. But it also says that we're invested collectively in education, that somehow what we're doing in this classroom has an impact in society at large, but also we're taking really seriously the terms by which we're conducting this class. And doing it in a public, and we usually use a Google Doc, just for those of you who are talking about the technical things. We'll do a public thing. Last year we published it on a Google Doc, our class constitution on a Google Doc, on GitHub, and on Rap Genius, so people could annotate. Rap Genius is a commercial tool. I think it now is just called Genius, but it was originally created for annotation of rap music lyrics. Now it's up for poetry. One of my friends taught a Fred Jameson essay on Rap Genius, which he thought was quite delightful. But it's great because it invites the world to be part of your class, but it also changes the responsibility the class has to the world in presenting learning in a way that is a social contract with a larger world. But I love it that the students come up with the terms. So sometimes when we do learning contracts, the students invent what does or doesn't count as learning. And I always do peer grading and peer evaluation and peer badging in my class. I've been doing that for about 8 years now. And that responsibility for evaluation, it's similar to what you were saying, Randy, about the feedback and learning criticism. I think one reason television shows like American Idol, or So You Think You Can Dance, or The Voice are so popular is we crave examples of how people learn from one another. And I don't think we get it very often in education. High-stakes testing is the opposite of a kind of assessment that actually leads you to then learn. Because you do it at the end of the class, you get a grade, and it's over, as if that somehow summarizes what learning is. What you're talking about in the crit session you did, you're constantly learning and taking that in and seeing that 10% of what you've done that's worthwhile and that you can develop into something more powerfully, which is how we learn just about every other way except in school. We have this very artificial way of setting the parameters of learning, where the teacher is not only the inauthentic person, but the whole device of assessment and evaluation, which we all know was invented in the 19th century. You know, a grade is literally falling off the grade of an assembly line. People didn't have typical grades in a class till 1897, I think, in higher education. Mount Holyoke was the first institution to adopt ABCD grading in higher education. And I love to tell the anecdote that the second institution I found that adopted ABCD grading was the American Meatpackers Association. And from the very beginning, the American Meatpackers put the metadata with their grading because they thought ABCD grading was too complicated for sirloin and chuck. And so you could always find out who gave the grade, what the criteria was in written comments, whereas educators took ABCD grading and it went like wildfire throughout the educational establishment. That's not, that's a very inauthentic, that is not like anything else you learn in the world. And it's a very, very inauthentic form of learning. And so trying to figure out more responsible ways is, to me, what connection is about, and a public face is part of that.
Yeah, that's great. Given what we know about the meatpacking industry at the turn of the century, grade inflation is a very scary concept. Really, just to build off of what Kathy was saying, I think the idea of creating a contract or compacts is probably an example of one of the two things I just wanted to add that I think are very important in open connected course. And Kathy has a lot more experience in really big open connected courses than I do. But one is, I think, that this sort of balance between structure and freedom, and I've always found this in all my teaching, that you have to figure out what is it that you need to be absolutely concrete about in order to make students comfortable, especially equitably comfortable, to then be very creative and free. But there are certain ground rules that have to be very concrete. If you get the proportions wrong, then there's chaos or worse. And then related to that, I think, is I've always felt that it's important to have both a safe space where you can teach critique. I mean, one of the key things about the multiple levels of crits in a studio, and this is the same thing with any class you teach, is that you have pretty intimate spaces in which you're modeling what it looks like to give and get critique in order so that all students, including those that don't have kind of the initial social or intellectual capital to feel undevastated by that kind of critique, they can really build up a sense of resilience and understanding and a sense of equality in the situation. So there has to be a safe place to sort of teach that critique to counterbalance this sense of openness and public critique or writing for the web or taking criticism from all directions.
I want to add one more thing in here. It strikes me that a lot of what we're talking about are things that we can do, but there's something else that I can't quite put my finger on it, but it's something that is done at DS 106. It's not clear who does it, but DS 106 is almost an example of something like a culture that's been created, and so a lot of like there's almost like this blooming, buzzing complexity of life happening over there that's just constantly bubbling up. And some of it comes, I think, from the playfulness of those who run it. So, the sort of antics of Jim Groom have actually produced all kinds of space for people to become playful themselves, right? So I think one other element that we haven't talked about is just sort of putting yourself out there and by doing it in however you're comfortable doing that. So not all of us are going to be Jim Groom, but kind of finding your authentic self that you can put out there, take a few chances, and as you take chances, other people take chances. I want to mention one other thing is these connected courses also, the most beautiful aspects can actually be when the center kind of loses its hold, right? And like, I think a lot of the learning that happens actually is kind of happening out on the edges where we don't even see it, and it's not monitored, and people are connecting their own new networks because of what's happening in courses like this. So, so all that said about the sort of playfulness and wide openness of all of this, ultimately we have to think also in education about assessment and feedback. And so I wondered if you guys had any comments on assessment and feedback generally, but also if you're running an open course, how does that look? There's some scale problems, of course, Kathy, you mentioned peer review. Maybe some tips on how to do that and how to do it well. Does anybody have any ideas on this element?
Do you want to start, Randy?
Well, and again, I haven't taught at the scale that you have. To me, it's a balance of sort of three things: of narrative, analytics, and sort of contextual assessment would be sort of the generic term. So it's the reflective piece of how students can narrate what they're learning and their journey. The assessment that they're getting from other people. Again, if you're working in authentic ways, that can be coming from all different directions, but how are you being judged by your peers? How are you being judged by the audience, by a client, whatever the authentic work is? But then increasingly, I think, we have analytics that we can look at and say which analytics matter. And I think engaging students in thinking about what is it around the traces of their activity they would like to count as the analytics of their own learning, the way that we pay attention to the data coming off of our wrist fuel bands and Fitbits and things. That part of, I think, what we're trying to teach students is to figure out how to take ownership of the markers of their own progress and the markers of their own success in the same way we want them to take ownership of their learning. So at some level, that has to be built into the assessment, certainly in an open and connected course.
Mm-hmm.
So I have spent the last 3 or 4 years working on open badging and trying to learn badging because I hate the current system of assessment. I am find No Child Left Behind and its high-stakes testing and the punitive attitude towards teachers enriches the test makers, but we know it doesn't enrich the learners. It certainly doesn't enrich the teachers. We have a greater problem with teacher dropout these days than with even student dropout. It's demotivating, and it's not good learning, and it's not even good for memorizing content. And we know this from Finland, that when they, in a country that abolished standardized testing, when the OECD asked Finland to take standardized tests, they did it just as a lark because they had a whole generation of students that had never seen them before, and it turned out they did better than anyone else on standardized testing. So I've been working with governments in Asia, Hong Kong, Singapore, Japan, and Korea. I've been invited to by the Departments of Education to talk about what we can do to get rid of standardized testing, because they do great on standardized tests. The U.S. does lousy on standardized tests. Doesn't matter. People are unhappy with it, and they don't motivate. So I really have been feeling like unless we can come up with another scalable, extensible, interoperable, digitizable, quantitative-based assessment system, but that is more flexible and gives real-time feedback, we're never going to get rid of standardized testing. So I've been really interested in what open source programmers invented at the beginnings of the open web, when they were inventing the internet using HTML and open programming language and contributing with anonymous partners around the world. What they learned about how you gave credit to people who could collaborate, not just because their programming skills were great, their HTML or their C++ or whatever, JavaScript or whatever programming language they were doing was good, but that they were the person who stayed up all night and were willing to deliver the code in order to make a deadline, or the person who always came up with a new idea. And places like Stack Overflow have come up with these very wide criteria of what learning is that aren't just about content mastery, but also about collaboration, about initiative, about imagination, about creativity, about good expression. All these things that, for example, employers say they want, but that we're so poor at delivering. All of the humanistic skills, reading and writing skills and communication skills that employers all say, on top of technical skills, are even more important. Actually, Google's own Project Oxygen says more important than technical skills are those communication skills. We have really terrible metrics for any of that, and they almost become invisible. So we use bad metrics that are proxies for the kind of learning we say we want in the workplace to assess skills that are not the skills that are the most valuable skills. So I've been really interested in looking at peer badging, and I've started doing, in fact, in this book that my students wrote, Field Notes for 21st Century Literacy, there's examples of peer badging in here. And how I set those structures so my students can create badges for each other. The key, and this is a very shorthanded, because I know this is not an event on badging, but a shorthand, is you never mark anyone negative. You only give a badge if somebody earns it, so you don't have to mark negative. Once you have to put failure in there. In fact, I'm writing a chapter now on the invention of failure, and there have been some good books on the invention of failure. Why in the world in education do we think we have to give an F? Why not just give points or give a grade when somebody achieves something? The way you do in karate. You don't fail karate, you just don't get the black belt. You're lazy at it. So, and that's much more of a model for everything we do outside of education. Why does there have to be something punitive? Why not let people earn what they've truly earned? Once you put a failure in there, you skew the whole system towards avoiding failure, which is faking the system. It's not really aspiring to the difficult, which is, don't tell me what failure is. Set the bar really, really high for achievement. And badging is all about, do you earn towards that achievement, and do your peers respect what you've contributed to their project and to a collective project? And so again, I don't want to hijack the conversation on badging, but until we change assessment, we can't change anything else. Until we change higher education, we can't change K through 12. Because as long as we're saying you have to have good SAT scores, no middle-class parent is going to want to deviate too much from what education is, because they want their kid to go to college. College is important, and middle-class parents still want, and working-class parents still want their kids to go to college. They're not going to mess with that. So we, as higher education, have to be leaders in saying we have different standards and better standards for formative, real-time, collaborative, accountable public assessment that is meaningful and really is not something you can gain, but is something that you earn in a truly important way. End of polemic. Getting off the soapbox. Sorry about that.
That was great, and it reminds me in my own classes, you know, we're in this structure where you have to give grades and that kind of thing. But within that structure, there's a lot of room, and one of the things that I've started doing is just giving what I call a not yet grade. I don't. If somebody wants to get an A, I set the bar high, and then they just turn in papers, and I say not yet, and I give them feedback on how to get it up to that level. And so nobody ever fails. Nobody gets an F. It's always just not yet. So I should also plug right now, Mimi Ito is running a conversation 1 week from now, exactly 1 week from now, on the 22nd, and it's all about this type of stuff, connected courses and recent research on assessment and new tools that are being researched right now that can get at some of these things that are typically more difficult to assess or have thought to be more difficult to assess. So Mimi will be running that conversation a week from now, so that should be really great, very pertinent to what we were just talking about. So we have about 13 minutes left, and I thought we want to get to some questions, but so maybe people on Twitter can start tweeting in some questions, and while we wait for those to come in, we're just going to have a little fun here and talk about the worst class we've ever taught. So do you guys want to talk about the worst class you ever taught and maybe talk about what some of those features were, what went wrong, that kind of thing?
Oh, I have a good one. Do you have one, Randy?
Well, you go ahead. Yes, but go ahead.
I taught once in the heyday of critical theory when I first came to Duke. I was the last full professor hired by Stanley Fish. That's some kind of badge of honor into the famous Duke critical theory department. One of my students turned to another and said, a student had said something, and the student said, "You obviously don't know your Benjamin," and put such a damper on the rest of the class, I couldn't get it back. And it's the only time I've ever had a situation where one student, who was obviously a brilliant, brilliant student who spoke many different languages, etc., one student's powerful dismissal with this tone of voice I can't begin to capture just tanked the class. And I happened that semester to be teaching an undergraduate class on the same topic as the graduate class, and it was on critical race theory as a model for all kinds of learning activism. So it was a kind of an interesting theoretical class where we were going back to Du Bois and Ida B. Wells and Douglas and great formulators of social activist and learning theory of the 19th century to think about social activism in the present. But this, you obviously don't know your Benjamin. I would walk from this vibrant undergraduate class across the hall like I was going to the guillotine into my graduate critical theory class, where it was all about citationality and whose theory was better than who else's theory, and I couldn't break it. I tried everything, every trick I knew, I tried. And finally I just said, okay, we're not meeting for 3 weeks. Go away, think about it, come back and see if we can fix this, because I don't have any more tricks left. And interestingly, when we came back, 2 of the students stepped forward and said, we don't know how to fix it, but we know we don't want to go on the way it was before, and we'll do everything we can to help. And even having 2 students empathize in that way with me as the failed teacher helped. It became a very quiet class. It was not an exuberant class. My classes are usually engaged. It was a very thoughtful, almost injured class. I don't know how the students feel. I'm friends with all of them on Facebook now. I've never gone back to ask how they feel about it. But it's a trauma, and I don't have I have no good solution out of it. But it was really a classist trauma. It was sometimes it happens. Maybe that's what we have to just say. Is sometimes it happens. I had no trick to solve that class.
Yeah.
Well, my example falls in the category of it seemed like a good idea at the time. I was teaching a course in 19th century American literature, and I was really trying to get students to learn how to move back and forth between the text and historical archives, and thinking that their engagement with kind of carefully curated, or at least first carefully curated historical archives, would drive them back to the text with questions, then they would see new questions in the text and go back to the archive. The idea that I had was that the way to create this dynamic would be to divide the class into thirds and have everybody reading a different novel. And they would work on the novel for 3 weeks, and then they would rotate novels and leave traces back for the people coming behind them. And then they would rotate again, and each time they would get deeper on what they were covering. So mapped out on paper, it was a beautiful vision.
That's great.
After this learning, and it was horrible. I described it at the time like riding a bicycle into a stiff wind from beginning to end. It was like Kathy's course. But what I realized, and it then set me actually on several years of doing kind of scholarship of teaching and learning around this problem, was that I was making very false assumptions and knew nothing about what happens when my students reread a text. So it wasn't so much a reading problem as a rereading problem. And I actually then went on and did a bunch of videotape think-alouds and studied the way my students would work through passages and whatnot, and learned that once they had something clever to say about a passage, they stopped reading it altogether. And I realized what they lacked was really the kind of middle part of those cognitive processes of figuring out how do you go back to a text and get new questions. They did not know how to do that on their own, and my entire elaborate, brilliant pedagogy was contingent on them doing that more or less on their own. And so it was a good example, I think, of really not knowing enough about how your students learn in order to build a very robust design around their learning.
Mm-hmm. I love that, because I love the idea that there's so many assumptions that we make as teachers and as learners that we don't even know we're making. By the time it's higher education, these are so ingrained that our own practices are invisible to one another. And I think one of the great things about connected courses is we get to be in conversation with each other in the moment of pedagogy. So we can really sort of explore some of those assumptions we don't really talk about or think about very deeply. And but we think we know. I mean, that's the dangerous part, is expertise. When we really feel confident that we know something, that's what is the problem.
Yeah. So we've had a couple good questions come in, and one I think is especially interesting from Jim Julius. He asked for us to reflect on outcomes-driven education versus purpose-driven. Is there a difference? And I mean, I think that speaks to a larger issue about what you guys think of the whole discourse around outcomes. And any thoughts on that?
I'll jump in on that if I can, because when I was reflecting on that question ahead of time, what you were phrasing as a purpose-driven course, to me that is the same thing as a competency-driven course, but where the competencies are really imagined as ways of being in that domain, the way you describe your kind of reset of your sense of what it means to teach anthropology. So what is it that I want my students to know and do but in a way in which I'm thinking very integratively about knowledge, skills, and dispositions. What does it mean to be in this field? What does it mean to operate in this domain around uncertainty, or to operate around some kind of problem solving or problem development? So in that sense, to me, a purpose-driven course and outcomes-driven are exactly the same, but with the major proviso that the outcomes are quite robust and very integratively understood.
And could I add one more? I think would be that you're kind of leaving it open to exactly what this way of being might be, and it might actually be outside the discipline itself. One of the things that or at least the way the discipline is currently defined, I think there's something kind of wonderful about, like I said, getting in touch with the sort of animating questions of a discipline, which are often transcendent of the discipline itself, of sort of where it stands at the moment. And I would even go so far as to say that as in higher ed, you know, there's a question of how I don't know, how much reverence we want to give to disciplines. I mean, disciplines are wonderful, but a lot of the questions we want to pursue are going to go outside of these disciplines in some way. And so I'm also thinking about, you know, the fact that we're not actually producing anthropologists and philosophers and so on. We are in a way providing the great sort of initiation ritual of our society. This is what makes them, I think Kathy mentioned earlier, like this is what ultimately makes them good adults, we hope, who have the capacity to find meaning and happiness and all those types of things as well. So I think the thing with outcomes is also I would just kind of leave it open as to what those outcomes are right through the course and right to the end of the course as well, and right, you know, through the whole journey of the student as well. I'm still open on that one, I guess.
You know, I agree with those comments completely, and one thing I've been doing a lot of is historical research on the evolution of outcomes thinking, and largely between 1865 and 1925 is when you have tremendous movement towards specifically Frederick Winslow Taylor and outcomes-driven productivity, not just in the factory. He, of course, did his studies of time and scientific labor management in the pig iron factory, which we now know were faked, which is interesting. We now know many of those studies he did with a stopwatch about how long does it take a man to push a wheelbarrow at 8 in the morning versus 10 at night, etc. It turns out when you go back and look at his archive, a lot of the data a lot of the output data that becomes the measurement of productivity for the 20th century was faked. So that's interesting. Mm-hmm. But two, that translation of output data, output-driven productivity from the factory to the corporation to Wall Street, which happens with SEO and return on equity and modern statistics, which is also being developed at that time, also then gets developed into the really rigid apparatus of education from 1860, majors, minors, distribution requirements, generation requirements, graduate schools, professional nursing schools, professional doctoral schools, professional business schools, professional, you know, all of those things get formalized. What is a discipline gets formalized in a very specific time period for and rationalized by the industrial age idea of productivity. Well, I think a lot of that has changed in our world. I mean, you know, when now anyone who has an idea can think about that idea and communicate it with anybody else. We don't really live in that outcomes-driven world anymore. So it's really belated that we're now going to formalize, and especially in K through 12, but more and more through higher education, punitive outcomes-driven education for higher education at a time when that's almost the opposite of the skill that our students need, that all of us need to navigate this world. I mean, I often use the joke that if I hurt my elbow, I don't call my doctor. I go to ihurtmyelbow.com and find out what total non-experts, people I've never met, people who have no credibility, tell me about bursitis in my elbow. And if it doesn't go away when I use these remedies I learn online, and somehow I have to learn how to evaluate that information, then I call my doctor, and it turns out the AMA did a study recently that 75% of doctors say to their patients when they come in, hey, what did you learn about your elbow before you came to talk to me now? We're all learning from each other in a new way, and we're now going to outcomes-driven 19th century, early 20th century productivity ideas of, in a world where anybody, Yelp, I don't know about you, but if I go to a restaurant, I go to Yelp first, to find out what some schmuck who I've never even met said about a restaurant. It's a very interesting world we're living in, and outcomes education is completely out of step with the everyday life that not kids, all of us live in every day of our lives. It's a really odd anachronism we're trying to enforce, and in some states actually regulate and make legal as part of an educational system. I think we have to fight that tooth and nail. We just have to fight that idea and remember
so that was
people.
That is worth like a whole other hour, I think, of discussion. It was wonderful to end on that note. We are out of time. I do want to mention, though, that there is Helen Keegan has a great ask of you all that you can get in on a make project. If you go to whydouteach.wordpress.com, she is inviting people to simply make a video or photo or write in anything you want to do and hashtag #WhyITeach, and we're going to try to get something going here, some sort of viral action in which this hashtag goes crazy, and we discover why all of you are teaching, and maybe it'll spread outside of connected courses as well. So please go to that. That's whydouteach.wordpress.com. Again, Mimi Ito will be here exactly 1 week from today with another live session. And I want to say thank you again to Kathy Davidson and Randy Bass. It's great to have you guys here. And thank you all for joining us.
Great to be here. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Bye.
Thanks for inviting us.